The day Caleb Mercer raised his hand at the county livestock auction, he thought he was bidding on a problem he could barely afford. The sign on the rail said she was 23. The clipboard beside it said, "Too wild for man." Someone had written it in red marker, the letters pressed hard enough to tear the paper. She stood behind the fence with her chin lifted, dust clinging to her boots and the cuffs of her jeans frayed from hard miles. Her hair was tied back with a strip of leather, not a ribbon. She didn't look scared. That was what unsettled him. The auctioneer rattled off her name like an afterthought. Mara Quinn. Ranch hand contract. 6 months. Cash up front. No guarantees. Caleb hadn't planned to bid on a person. He'd come to sell a half-lame steer and maybe buy feed he could put on credit. His ranch was sinking, inch by inch, into the red. Drought had cracked the earth open like old bones. His father's land, his father's pride, and the last thing he had left that still felt like home was slipping through his fingers. But when he looked at her, standing straight while men whispered and laughed, something twisted inside him. He recognized that look. The look of being misjudged until you start believing it yourself. The look of someone who had been written off. The bidding was light. A few men threw numbers just to see her flinch. She didn't. When the price stalled, Caleb heard his own voice cut through the dust and murmurs. It startled him as much as anyone. Sold. Mara met his eyes then. There was no gratitude there. No relief. Just a steady assessment, like she was deciding whether he was a threat or a waste of time. He paid the clerk and signed the papers with a hand that felt numb. He told himself he needed help on the ranch. Someone who could ride fence, mend wire, maybe break a horse if they had the grit. He told himself it was practical. What he didn't tell himself was that he couldn't stand the idea of her being hauled off by someone who wanted to prove that, too wild, was just another word for something they could break. The truck ride back to his ranch was quiet. The road stretched long and pale, heat rippling above it. Mara sat in the passenger seat with her boots propped on the dash, hat low over her eyes. She didn't ask questions. Neither did he. When they arrived, the ranch looked smaller than Caleb remembered. The barn leaned a little more to the left. The fence post sagged. The land still carried the scent of sage and sun, but it felt tired. "This is it?" Mara asked, stepping down from the truck. "This is it," Caleb said. She looked around, then nodded once. "I can work with this." He showed her the bunkhouse, a small structure that hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in years. She dropped her duffel inside and came back out without comment. That night, Caleb lay awake listening to coyotes and wondering what he'd done. He wasn't a man who made impulsive choices. His life had been shaped by careful steps and quiet endurance. Buying a contract on a woman labeled too wild felt like stepping off a cliff. In the morning, he found her already in the corral. She was on one of his younger horses, a bay colt that had thrown 2 men and nearly broken a third. Caleb had planned to sell him cheap, chalk him up as another loss. Mara moved with the horse like she'd been born there, her body loose and balanced, hands gentle but firm. The colt tossed his head, tested her, then settled. Caleb leaned against the fence, heart pounding. He didn't interrupt. He watched as something ancient and graceful unfolded in front of him. When she finally dismounted, she grinned, breathless. He just needed someone to listen. Caleb swallowed. "Where did you learn to ride like that?" She shrugged. "Same way you learned to survive. No one else was going to do it for me." Over the weeks that followed, Mara worked harder than anyone Caleb had ever known. She rose before dawn and stayed out after dusk. She mended fences with hands that knew wire and splinters intimately. She rode the far edges of the property like she was mapping her own freedom into the land. The townsfolk noticed. They talked. "She's trouble," the feed store clerk warned him. "Girl like that don't settle." Caleb nodded and said nothing. He was starting to understand that settling wasn't the point. They didn't talk much at first. Conversation came in fragments, exchanged over coffee or during long rides. Caleb learned that Mara had grown up bouncing between ranches, her parents gone before she was old enough to remember them. She'd been traded for labor, passed along when she got too opinionated or refused to be small. "They don't like it when you don't scare easy," she said once, adjusting a saddle. "They think fear is respect." Caleb felt something crack open in his chest. He knew that language. His father had spoken it fluently. One afternoon, a storm rolled in fast and furious. The sky darkened, thunder splitting the air. A section of fence gave way, and a handful of cattle bolted toward the ravine. Caleb and Mara rode hard, rain stinging their faces. A flash of lightning spooked Caleb's horse. He felt the ground vanish beneath him, the sickening weightlessness before impact. Pain exploded through his leg as he hit the ground. Mara was beside him in seconds. She calmed the horse, checked him over, and braced his body against the mud. "Don't move," she said, voice steady despite the storm. He looked up at her, rain tracing lines down her face, eyes fierce with focus. He realized then how much he trusted her. How completely. She got him back to the house, splinted his leg, and stayed by his side through the night. When the pain dulled enough for him to sleep, she sat at the table, hands wrapped around a mug, staring at the wall like she was holding something together by sheer will. In the days that followed, Caleb was forced to rest. The ranch kept moving because Mara moved it. She handled things without complaint, without asking for praise. She didn't need permission to lead. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the fields, Caleb watched her ride back toward the house. The way she sat her horse, the way she seemed to belong to the land and the moment all at once, stirred something deep inside him. Not possession, not control, recognition. "You were born for this," he said when she dismounted. She studied him for a long moment. "So were you. Somewhere along the way, someone told you you weren't." The words hit harder than the fall had. Trouble came in the form of a letter. A developer wanted the land. Offered a sum that would erase Caleb's debts and then some. He knew what selling would mean. Progress, they called it. Houses where cattle grazed. Silence where wind once sang. He sat with the letter until his hands shook. Mara found him there. She read his face and didn't ask questions. She just sat beside him. "I don't want to lose this," he said finally. "But I don't know how to save it." She took a deep breath. "Then let me help you fight." They took a risk together. A big one. They opened the ranch to riding lessons, trail experiences, a place for people who wanted to learn respect instead of domination. Mara taught like she rode, with patience and fierce honesty. People came. Word spread. Not everyone approved. The developer pushed harder. Threats came, quiet and sharp. One night, the barn caught fire. Caleb woke to smoke and the crackle of flames. He ran, legs screaming in protest, heart hammering. Mara was already there, hauling tack. Leading horses out, shouting orders like she'd always owned the place. They saved what they could. Watched the rest burn. Caleb sank to his knees in the dirt, grief tearing through him. The barn had been his father's. His last anchor. Mara stood beside him, ash streaking her face. "We can rebuild," she said. "Or we can walk away. But you don't have to decide alone." He looked at her then, really looked. Not as a hired hand. Not as a contract. As an equal. As someone who had chosen him as much as he had chosen her. "I didn't buy you," he said, voice rough. "I paid for time. And you gave me more than that." She smiled softly. "You gave me a place to be wild without being punished for it." They rebuilt. Slower than before. Stronger. The ranch became something new, something rooted in old truths and fresh courage. Caleb's leg healed, though it ached when the weather turned. Mara stayed long after the contract ended. On the day the land was finally safe, protected by easements and community support, they rode the perimeter together. The sky stretched wide and blue. The future felt uncertain and open. Mara turned to him, eyes bright. "You ready for what comes next?" Caleb smiled, a quiet, deep thing that reached his bones. "With you. Yeah, I am." They rode on, side by side, not taming the land or each other, but honoring the wild that had always known where it belonged.